All right, we're going to get started, everyone. I know a few people might still be joining, coming in late for the 11 a.m. start, but I just want to say thank you, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate you attending to learn a little bit more about startup recruiting. I'm Mike Kehoe from OnePiece. We're a cross-border co-working space and accelerator with offices across the US and China. And I'm really happy today to welcome the Sourcery team. So I'll hand it over to them to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Mike. Wanted to thank everyone for making it, and wanted to thank OnePiece as well for hosting us. They've got a wonderful co-working space, and we've had clients here, and we're looking forward to doing stuff with them and partnering with them and doing a big value add for what their community has to offer. They've got amazing stuff going. So about the Sourcery, this is a very popular topic, and the real question is, what does a brilliant startup, how are they going to be able to compete with some of the other global Goliaths? And so this is something that we've had to help other companies solve for. And so I'm going to hand it over to our fearless leader, Jessica Stilo, to kind of lead the discussion on how we do that. Just take it away.
All right, so we put together a little deck. Hopefully you guys can see and follow along, some visuals. And the plan is to talk a little bit about the talent landscape. So just what's going on in talent today, the strategy for your search, what moves top talent, putting all of this together, and then finally the pitching. And I know that the topic is pitching, but really we want to set everybody up so that the pitch is well received. And that's a really important part of pitching, is winning. So the talent landscape, why is it so hard for startups to recruit right now? Everybody knows that unemployment is at a historic low, but this is really just to say that the struggle is real. You guys are having a hard time with this. Everyone is having a hard time with this. Startups are particularly high risk, which is a challenge. So you're a risky proposition for somebody to come and join your company. You're not a tried and true known entity, so that makes it harder for you to recruit. Startups have fewer resources. You're not going to outcompete a Google or an Apple, or as Michael said, a global Goliath. You don't have as many resources at your fingertips to use in recruiting or in wooing candidates to work with you. Startups are high intensity, pressure, and impact. And startups clone. So cloning means that when startups basically get started, often the founders hire other people who they know, right? And it tends that people know people like themselves. Maybe you went to school together, maybe you worked together previously, but for one way or another, you're connected. And that can create a cloning environment where the first, I would say 5 to 7 people often share characteristics, and that can make it difficult for you to then go outside of that kind of cloning pattern and hire somebody really different. Startups also lack brand recognition. So this is just to say that, nobody except for your mom has heard of your startup. And that means that when you're contacting people to join, they don't have immediate brand recognition and name recognition and think, oh my God, I've always wanted to work there. I heard it's amazing. They probably haven't heard that yet. So that leaves you at a little bit of a disadvantage. So basically, as a startup trying to recruit in today's environment, you are surrounded by lions and tigers and bears. And you might definitely be having a little bit of a Wizard of Oz moment where you're feeling like, oh my, how am I going to compete? I wanted to bring up a case study because I like stories, and also because I think sometimes hearing an actual story of how somebody else in your space has competed successfully before is helpful. So we're going to talk about a company that is near and dear to my heart called Pantheon. And Pantheon has now raised over $150 million in venture capital. They're in a series, I believe just raised a Series D. So they've been really successful and around for years. But just like everybody else, they started out sort of on an uphill battle trying to put the team together. And this is sort of what it looked like. So they have Zach, the CEO, represented over here. They have Josh, who actually worked with Zach in their first job together. They have David, who worked with Josh and Zach at the last company. And they've got Matt, who worked with David at his last company. So you see this kind of web of interconnectedness starting. And then they managed to hire this angel, employee number 1, and this other angel, employee number 2. And that's where they kind of hit an inflection point where they needed to hire somebody who they weren't able to find from within their network. They needed to hire their first DevOps engineer, and that's represented by this person over here. And they were like, oh my God, DevOps, like we have all of this depth in these certain skill areas, but we've never hired a DevOps engineer before. And that was when they came to us, just to kind of say, like, what do I do? And over the course of this webinar, we're going to talk about what they did so that you can do the same thing. So, oh yeah, and basically the lions and tigers and bears here, we're there for them as well and are represented by these buildings in the background. Okay, so what are you going to do? We're going to define who you're trying to hire, because believe it or not, like, believe it or not, startups are stressful, and you need to hire lots of things. And sometimes that need can create kind of a conflation where you need lots of stuff and it's hard to see clearly who to hire. We're going to talk about finding the right candidate, and then we're going to talk about the pitch, so that we're pitching the right role to the right person, and we're making them the correct offer. So let's start by defining who you're trying to hire. The first thing that I think you should think about is identifying the work that you need done and prioritizing your needs. And here's what that looks like. So the work, for example, that somebody like Pantheon might need done is this list. So they need all of these things. They need backend software engineering. They also need JavaScript. They need testing automation. They need mobile app development. They need management experience. They need NoSQL experience. They need scalable backend architecture, uptime. They need potato gun calibration. They need design sense. They need a cat enthusiast. Like the list goes on and on and on, right? And so what I had them do is sort of, we want to think about putting everything down that you need and then prioritizing the list. So this list has already been prioritized. So the backend software engineering is the #1 pain point for them right now. And you can see, looking at this list, that some of these things probably wouldn't go like naturally together in the same software engineer's profile with backend software engineering. You might get somebody who has backend software engineering and all 12 plus other traits, but you may also find that you won't. And most likely you'll see backend software engineering lined up with 6 through 8, right? Like you could find backend software engineering with NoSQL, with scalable backend architecture, and with on-call uptime. But backend engineering and JavaScript, maybe with Node, like possible. But what I suggest is that we look for the backend software engineering. Any of the other things on the list that we happen to get, we consider nice to haves. And we consider anything besides 6, 7, and 8 like nice to haves, like almost like subcategory as like, it would also be great, but it's not expected. Okay, so we're looking for the stuff that's kind of highlighted in blue, as that sort of would be a typical profile that we might find. So now the search is a little more calibrated. The other thing to note when you're doing this, and this is like a page right out of The Hard Thing About Hard Things. If you guys haven't read that book, it's fabulous. But is to focus on what your company needs in the next 6 months when you're thinking about making this hire, not what you're going to need 6 months from then. Meaning that like a year from now, you know that you need an engineering leader. Maybe you know that you need a head of engineering, but right now today you need a version 1 and you need somebody who's a really strong backend engineer. So it's really natural for you to be like, oh, I want a really strong backend engineer who could be my head of engineering. But what I'm suggesting is, if you don't get the really strong backend engineer, you're never going to get to the point of needing the head of engineering. So focus on getting the skill that you need to get to your goal of where you want to be in 6 months, and make the other stuff nice to have, but don't try to put it all together in one sandwich.
Right. And so have you found this? I mean, this was a problem that came up at my last startup, and coming up here is, depending on the stakeholder you ask, this list ends up being in a different order.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. I think this is a great thing to do as a group. And essentially you have to make a captain of that hiring committee. Like somebody has to be the final say, that person is the hiring manager. And ultimately their prioritization is the prioritization of the company, and everybody else needs to get on board. And if you feel like you have somebody on your hiring committee who isn't on board, they should not be on your hiring committee. Right? Because that's going to make the decision very, very challenging to make. But yeah, putting this together as a group so that everybody understands and is on the same page, totally agree. 100%. Before you go into the interviews, you want to make sure you're all aligned in who we're looking for in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, so we're basically going to make sure that we're identifying the key criteria as a group or a hiring committee. The other things you want to think about are whether or not the person is capable of doing the work, not necessarily that they've already done it. So it's really classic. I believe it's called like confirmation bias, essentially, that you know, if somebody has on their resume that they've already done the job, then you 100% know that they're capable of doing it.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, though, then you're not hiring for the potential to do it. You're hiring for what we call kind of been there, done that skills. And that is going to mean that that person has probably moved on beyond that skill and is looking to do something else now, right? Because we all want to learn and grow and continue. So it's totally fine to look for somebody who has a skill already, but it's even better if you can look for somebody who has the potential to have that skill, right? So can they do the work? And I guess one of the things on that is just like, for you to think about with your hiring committee is what are the things that you can look for that would indicate to you that they have the potential to be able to do the work, right? Like what would those indicators look like on a resume?
Because you need to uncover kind of, or offer a new potential to maybe younger talent. Otherwise you'll never beat the big players that you're competing with, right? But they've been there, done that.
Right.
They'll go take the safe, highly paid bet, right?
Yep.
Highly paid in cash.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So then you want to think about just to help you, like basically what we're doing is we're fleshing out a profile, almost like a persona that you would do if you were starting a marketing campaign. You're thinking like, who's our customer? I'm basically saying the same thing, but I'm saying like, who's our candidate? So like, how will we identify them? How do we know that they can do the work? What are they doing right now? Like, what's their current job title? Where do they work? What kinds of projects are they working on? And that kind of information is going to help you figure out what you have to offer them.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why it's really important for us to create that target profile. So we're trying to align like what you need with a certain type of person. Here's a more concrete example. So we're back to our list of the 12 things, and we know that the person has to have back-end software engineering, but an example of a target profile might be that we think we can find somebody who wants more impact of their work. We think that they might want to become a manager.
Mm-hmm.
We think that they might want to play with cooler, more cutting edge technologies. And we think they probably work at a bigger company now. So then we can create a custom pitch with this information, right? We're going to specifically focus on the impact that they're going to have in this organization, in this job. We're going to focus on the fact that this role has management potential. We're going to focus on these more cutting edge technologies than what they're getting to use right now, potentially. And that's going to allow us to have a successful pitch for that type of candidate. So we're going to look for potential. Here's a more concrete example of like when you actually have a resume in front of you, what looking for potential could look like. So this is hard because I wanted to make it big enough for you guys to be able to see it. So we're looking at a resume from the bottom up. So the first thing that this person has on their resume is the developer intern job at BCS Innovations in India. Then they moved on to University of California at Chico as a research assistant. Then they moved on to being a student web IT assistant. Most people would look at this resume and be like, I'm not impressed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't love Chico. I don't know how I feel about international work experience. We're moving up towards the top. Then they moved on to being a teaching associate on campus. And then they were a software engineer at this little company called Blue Planet that nobody's ever heard of. And that was in Petaluma, which is not a hotbed of technology. So a lot of folks would dismiss this resume without ever reading any of the bullet points under it. People tend to read resumes like they're just reading the titles and dates. But the next thing that this person went on to do was this.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a real like example, you know, then they went on to be a software engineer at Apple, and now everybody and their brother wants to hire this person. Right. But what I'm saying is that basically we want to be in between this, like this work at Blue Planet and Apple. We want to be the company that sees the potential in this candidate.
If you really want to compete, if it's obvious that they're good, everyone will go after them, right? You'll never make it through the noise contacting them.
Exactly. And if you dive into the bullet points in here, you'll see some things that do show that this person is working with, I don't want to say like super cutting edge technologies, but very applicable stuff for a lot of the things that you guys are trying to build out. Probably they were working with RESTful APIs. They're familiar with Python and Django, you know, and you can see like, okay, if they know how to do that, maybe they know how to do what I want them to do, even though it's not explicitly listed. So again, just looking for the potential. You want to be the same as those Apple recruiters, able to look at somebody for potential and then basically rule them in rather than looking for reasons to rule them out. If you're looking at resumes for reasons to rule people out, you will always find one. If you're looking at, could this person potentially help us? that's the attitude to have when you're looking at a resume, ideally.
Yep.
That makes sense.
And then one other key point I think you hit on that's really important when the selling process of your company is job impact. I've always used that to get people more excited about the job. So they're either kind of deciding, like this example, they're maybe deciding between big and continuing with a small company. I assume Blue Planet was also a smaller company. So you can sell it that way if they're kind of going either or, but especially if they used to be at a big company, you can almost always make that sell, right? Definitely. Because, you know, they're probably working on a very, very narrow role at a big company, and you can kind of give them the more broad range of responsibility.
Yeah, and if you can come up with that persona where you're saying like, oh, they probably were working at a bigger company, I have an impact pitch, then you know where to look for them too. If you need to go out and actually source or find candidates, you have an idea of where you can find somebody who you can make a compelling pitch to.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's get into what motivates candidates or what moves top talent. So the way that I think about this is that I break it into 6 different categories. So this is essentially like your toolbox is what I'm thinking. And for every job that you're gonna be interviewing candidates for, you basically wanna develop a few bullet points or a pitch for each one of these 6 motivating factors. Basically, all candidates, I think, as they move, even when they a new job, they have sort of a ranking in mind of which ones of these are important to them. And then as they sort of develop in their career, even in that role, their ranking of these things may change over time. That's totally typical. And if they decide that they're interested in moving on to a new company, they're probably thinking that there's some mismatch in here where something on this list is important to them and they're not going to be able to get it at their current company. For example, maybe lifestyle is a very classic one here in the Bay Area. Maybe at their current company, they have to commute into the office every day. It's a particularly long commute and they're looking to spend more time with their family and at home, so they want to shorten their commute. When they took the job, that wasn't a factor. Now it's a factor for them, and there's nothing their current company is going to do to change that. Now there's sort of that mismatch. For you guys, that's an opportunity. Anytime there's a mismatch between what the candidate is currently having and what they'd like to have, that's an opportunity, and we want you to have sort of pitch points aligned with that particular opportunity. So for all 6 factors, our ideal outcome is that you feel like you have things about your company that you can pitch to all 6 of these. Some of them are going to be stronger than others. That's totally natural. You're going to have places where your company really shines and places where you're like, ooh, could use improvement. But also there are going to be people who are right and wrong to fit in with your company and your culture. So that makes sense. Okay, so oops, that moved really fast, sorry. So essentially what we're getting at is these are the things that as a startup you can compete on really strongly. So one thing that startups do particularly well is speed. You move fast and you do break things. But if you're coming out of a huge company, for example, speed can be a real selling point because it can feel like you're very dynamic. Things are constantly moving and in flux. And sometimes people get tired of sort of a slow moving Goliath-y status quo feeling, or it's so hard to get a project through, or it's so hard to get something to see the light of day, or to get provisioning for this thing I want to do. You're not going to have that at a startup typically. So speed can be a selling point. Another, like we were saying, is impact. Another is just opportunity, like for promotion, for example, to move into a new role. Because startups are growing really rapidly, it's actually like big companies have an opportunity for you to move laterally around a huge organization, but startups have that opportunity often and quickly. So a new role opens up and you want to go do it. Usually there's not a ton of crazy application process. And it's just like, great, you're here, please do that. There's also a lot of variety. You have the opportunity to wear many hats at a startup. And for some people, that's a huge selling point. And of course, there's the deferred comp, which if we didn't mention it, we would be crazy, meaning the opportunity potentially for your equity to be worth life-changing money.
And another one I've seen is kind of parallel to impact as well is sort of mission alignment, at least the last 2 companies. So I used to work for an education company. Now it's this cross-border company. They're people really passionate about online education, or really passionate about, you know, linking certain tech hubs or cross-border hubs. That's been a really big recruiting advantage for us, because otherwise, right, it's like, okay, I can go work at this large company. It looks good on the resume, but, you know, if I release this widget slightly better for version, you know, whatever it is, it's not that compelling to them. I've seen that be a really good pitch as well. Is there any, I kind of just have a question from my perspective, is there any way sort of more at the top of the funnel to filter people for that passion alignment. Because one thing I've tried before, and this is through like Indeed or other job boards, you can ask a few written questions. And I'd say, you know, I don't want to take a lot of time, because if you ask them to do something really time intensive, you'll lose a bunch of people.
Yeah.
But I say, hey, just give me 3 bullet points why you want to work at an education company. And that's been an incredibly good top of funnel filter. It's just basic, right? Because then I just know, okay, 50% of people, they either just didn't bother answering it. If you can't write 3 bullet points, forget about it anyways.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like, have you guys worked on any other top of funnel filters for some of these sort of pitch points?
I think that's a great question. I think that's a great way to do it, is to do some kind of written but not like high intensity question. I think it's kind of 2 things. Like, you want to think about whether or not you want to filter people by passion.
Okay.
Like, if the passion is something that's going to make them able to do the job or not. So I think you want to consider that. And if it's really important that they have it, then I love that suggestion of how you do it. I think we should also beware that nobody's going to be passionate about your company, especially a startup, until they're in.
Yeah.
Like, they may like kind of, I mean, not nobody. You guys are now thinking of 800 examples of people.
You need incredible employer branding for people to come in.
Like, you're trying to get them to take the chance, right?
Yeah.
But they're not as in love with your product or your company as you are. And I think that that's one of the things that's really hard for us as startup founders.
True.
Like, we're totally in love with it.
Yeah.
But like, you've had every night for years dreaming about it. You've been thinking about it 24 hours a day. And this is a candidate who works somewhere else who's like, I'm kind of interested. And I see this a lot, is that companies will be like, well, I'm not really getting the passion. And I'm like, no, you're not. But that doesn't mean that they're not interested. And sometimes I think this also, I don't want to like digress too far, but I do also want people to be aware that this can create bias and is dangerous, especially in gender diversity hiring. So this is like a classic thing where I'm like trying to find the right words, but essentially that when you're looking for gender diversity on your team, women typically tend to look for roles with more security, and they tend to be like maybe a little more skeptical about like jumping in head first to a highly risky situation for that reason. So they may not perform as well in an interview where you're looking for kind of look before you leap passion and have a lot of questions. And that could also be a reason, and there's like a million reasons, but why we see fewer women coming out of college and going directly into startups than we see males coming out of computer engineering and going directly into startups. We could talk about that all day, but things just to think about. So moving back to our startup game and what moves the talent, we want to think about how you translate those selling points about a startup into things that your candidates are going to see specifically. So employer brand is a phrase that you're going to hear a lot. Our fabulous marketing person thinks about this for us and for our clients. So employer brand, you see employer brand when you see whether a startup is stealth or non-stealth, for example. A stealth mode startup means that for one reason or another, the company has decided not to share what their product is, potentially even who's on their team, what the name of the company is. Like, depending on the level of stealthiness, there may be very, very little information available. And again, you just want to think about what that's going to create in a candidate. And potentially, like we were just saying about sort of typically female versus male engineering students coming out and going out into the work world, who you're going to appeal to because you have a stealth brand versus a non-stealth brand where you're actually like trying purposefully to put yourselves out there. Another one is kind of grim versus non-grim is what I say. So a lot of startups can be grim when you first start out, meaning like dark, dingy, potentially. Like their space is physically like dark and dingy. Like they may be fabulous, but the team might be so focused on the product, right? Makes sense, that you haven't thought about like furniture or lighting or...
Which is why you should come move into a OnePiece office. Just a quick shameless plug. Yeah. We'll pan out to the office later. But no, it's true.
And actually, like for some people, they have a hard time seeing past the fact that there's nowhere to sit. And it can make it look like you don't have your shit together, basically. Like, even though you you do in a lot of ways. It's just like a visual representation of how together you are. I'm not explaining this super well, but you definitely want to consider that. Especially you'll see this actually when you go out to hire designers, for example. Startups that are particularly grim have a difficult time hiring creatives often because they feel like, is what I bring to the table going to be valued here, or is this a group of people that doesn't really value this?
I would just, the way I've kind of summarized it to other people on my team is just remember you're selling as well. A lot of people get this power dynamic, especially if it's the first time they've hired. They're like, I'm the person hiring, right? So it kind of doesn't matter what I put forward, but especially as a startup. I mean, if you're Apple, maybe you don't have to sell, but as a startup, you do. So before I bring someone into a conference room, I'm going to wipe down the whiteboard. I'm going to clean up the table. I'm going to empty the trash. It's like little things like, what would you do if you were preparing to go into an interview? Because you want, they're little cues that you have your shit together.
Yes. Right? And if you don't want to take the time to do it, I totally agree. Like, look at co-working spaces. Like, it's okay for you not to want to do this. But what's not okay is like an office where you bring people in and you expect them to sit on the floor and you're like, this is a test of whether or not they're going to do well at this job. What I want you to think about is like, is this really a test of whether or not they can do the job? Like, are we, you know, is this like are we confirming what is true? Like, are you trying to say like, cause we're never getting chairs? So we want to make sure we're not biasing in places we don't want to. So the next one is kind of translating these needs. Like we kind of put those categories up. What those mean to candidates often. So culture was the first one. That's sort of relationships and reputation is what they're thinking about. Like, who am I going to get to work with? How do we interact together? Like, what kind of reputation does this company have, if any, for the way that people interact with each other here? That's a lot of what culture is. It's not so much anymore like whether or not you have fun events or, you know, fabulous outings, like that stuff is important too, right? But that's almost like a byproduct of a culture as opposed to that being the culture. So when you think about culture and you talk about culture with potential candidates, I think like decision-making process might be something that you want to speak about as opposed to like, we go bowling every Wednesday, which is also both good. But real like work culture is often about how decisions are made. Does that make sense?
Or if you're like design focused or very much like engineering focused company. Yeah,
totally. Okay, so then meaning is the next one. To a lot of candidates, when they think of meaning, they think of mission and impact again. So they're thinking about telling their friends that they work there and whether or not their friends would basically like be impressed, you know, and think it was cool. And sometimes that is like, oh, is it a flashy consumer brand? That kind of impressed. But sometimes it's like, oh, I'm changing the world in this really meaningful way. And just because you're not like a philanthropic organization or, you know, saving all of the dolphins, that doesn't mean that you don't have a mission and a meaning and an impact that's going to resonate with people. So again, I want to emphasize that every single one of these areas, you do have bullet points, like you have tangible selling points. Some will be stronger than others, but say you're a back-end web services company, back-end web services companies, your product is super sexy to someone. When you hit this like meaning bullet point, your meaning actually may be that for engineers, you're improving their quality of their day-to-day life because you're making a product that makes their day better. That is true meaning. And that's not to be overlooked because the people that you're pitching to, especially if you're hiring for engineering roles, they've had that exact pain point. So this is actually going to be super meaningful for them. Okay, so don't overlook it and don't just be like, oh, nobody's gonna like we have no meaning bullet point. You do. Lifestyle, flexible hours, office location. So I run into this with earlier stage companies all the time. They're like, we don't have a lifestyle pitch. I expect people to sleep under their desk. I get it, because you sleep under your desk, because you're working so hard to build the company. But especially if you're looking to get experience, been there, talent in the door, meaning like I'm looking to hire somebody who has done this before several times and I want to bring them in and have them do it for me, that person is usually beyond the place in their career where they want to sleep under their desk. But that doesn't mean that they don't want to work really hard, and it doesn't mean that they don't want to put in the hours. But again, we want to be careful about whether or not, like, does sleeping under the desk mean that they're putting in a lot of work? Not necessarily.
Just a FaceTime game at a certain point.
Yeah. So we want to be thinking about like, how am I going to know that this person is working really hard? Hopefully it's going to be because they're hitting deliverables, right?
Yep.
Not because I see them in the office at 6 a.m.
The way I pitch it is like, hey, once in a while we're going to have a really intense project and we might expect people to stay late, but it's not a regular thing.
Right, totally.
And then the other thing to balance too is people will have these job descriptions, hiring managers, where they want experience. Well, as people get more experience, they might have a family, right? I mean, these things, right? Yeah. So generally, as you start to expand the responsibilities or experience you want them to have, they're going to be less and less likely to want to go to really extreme lifestyles. Yeah.
And we could talk about this all day. We could just talk about kind of the future of work and lifestyle and location and how important it is. But I will say that to think about whether or not what you want, which is like you want everybody in one office all day, all the time, if that's what you need, and if what that's going to do to the talent that you're able to recruit, and if there would be a way for you to do it where you could get what you need without having those requirements. Because that ability to be flexible is going to help you, again, just to compete. The job. So this one is, you have things to say about the job that you're willing to offer. And one of the coolest things about a startup is that probably the job that you're willing to offer, right, when we think of that list of 12 things, actually has a fair amount of flexibility around it. Like if you want to be the cat wrangler and the back-end engineer, we have a role for you. In bigger companies, it's not necessarily as easy to customize the job. Like you may be a P2E and that has these requirements. At a small company, you can kind of think about customizing the job around what a person is looking for. The only caveat is like, don't make promises that you can't cash. So like, don't promise somebody that they're going to be the head of global something when you're a 4-person company. But you can paint a picture of the opportunities that there will be and that they would be eligible potentially for those opportunities in the future. So think about the role, think about the possibility of leadership. Like in a startup, I can't think of a job where you couldn't offer somebody the potential for leadership, right? Because like there's potential for leadership everywhere. That's not necessarily true of every job in every company.
And leadership doesn't necessarily have to be people management.
Nope.
You could say you're the sole responsible party for this important project. And I also tell people, I say, think about the bullet point that will be on your resume after you do this. Right? So you have to be realistic. What's the book Reid Hoffman came out with, like the tours of duty, 18 to 20 months, right? Like, look, I know you're not going to be here for life. Maybe the company will be here. I mean, it's a startup, right? Like things come and go. But, think about after 2 solid years here, what are the bullet points on your resume that you led? And that can get people excited, even if it's not a people management position.
Yeah, I agree. So the final one is compensation. This is one that startups all the time are like, I'm not going to compete here at all. Like I'm done with it. And again, I want you to think about that you still have meaningful kind of bullet points, selling points, pitch points under every one of these topics. For some people, that deferred compensation potential, the potential to have this like an exit, a white whale like level of life change, and like life-changing money isn't millions of dollars for everybody. Life-changing money can be, I got a comma in my bank account. Like it totally depends on who you're talking to. So do think about the potential for deferred compensation as being meaningful, and think about other types of compensation that you can offer in addition to salary. So you have a lot that you can potentially offer with the job. Okay, so that's kind of how we translate those particular categories and how you can think about sort of bullet points for your company that would fall under each one of them. So you're going to define the role really clearly, identify the right person for the role, refine the pitch. The way that this looks, coming back to our case study in practicality, this is a pretend picture of the ideal DevOps candidate that Pantheon wanted to hire. And this is what that person is thinking. So these are kind of those categories again listed, and this is just an example ranking. If Nick, who's the candidate, was to rank what he cared about right now in moving to a new job, he would put the job itself as the highest ranking, meaning it's the most important to him is that he's really looking for leadership potential. He's been a contractor for a couple of years. He didn't have a lot of potential to become a manager in that role. He's also therefore ranking really highly relationships, right? Because he didn't really have close bonds with his coworkers because he was remote and distributed. So he's actually looking to have a closer relationship. And then this other stuff, like he cares about a company culture, he cares about lifestyle, financial is important, someday he's interested in having a family, all that the company knows at this point is that they've seen Nick's resume and they really want to hire him, but they have no idea how to pitch to him specifically. So what they have to figure out is they have to ask him questions and really listen to find out which of those things are important to him. So you have to tell the right person the right story. And in order to do that, you have to have a conversation. So this is like thinking through your sort of first phone screen with a candidate. You want to be asking kind of questions around these 6 things to figure out which one does it seem like they care about. You don't have to like have a perfect pitch for every single one right now in your first interview. You really want to focus on just listening. So after our first conversation with Nick, the hiring managers at Pantheon came out with a ranking that looked like this. They weren't able to specifically be like, oh yeah, Nick is a 3 in this thing. But what they got was that they got a feeling that he cared about maybe the meeting or the job. Like we said, they got a feeling that he cared about one of these. And that's what I want you to come out of your first conversation with a potential candidate with, is a feeling for like, I think that it seems like these things are kind of important to this person. That's good. That's a good start. The most important thing actually that doesn't happen is like we're so intent. It's kind of like when you introduce yourself to somebody and you're so intent on saying your own name, like, right? Like you're going to forget it, that you like don't hear them say their name. I do that all the time. Maybe other people don't do that. But it's like the same thing happens in an initial interview. Sometimes you're so focused on like, because you're excited about the candidate, you've seen their resume, either trying to pitch or trying to grill, that you don't actually take the time to do this other thing, which is to like ask questions and listen. And then you go into subsequent interviews and you still don't have this information. So my ideal is like, don't wait until you're going to close the candidate to find out what they care about. Start the process immediately. And like you said, continue to pass that information forward to other interviewers throughout the process, but we'll get to it.
Okay, good. Jumping again.
Yeah, no, perfect though. Okay, so the final steps of a sound strategy are to create an actual interview plan. What I mean by this is like, you now know what the skills are that you're looking for, right? So who's going to interview for which skill or which area, and then who's going to pitch which of those 6 things. So ideally, this is the part that people forget about, is to create an actual pitch plan. Like they remember the interview part and they're like, yeah, you're going to cover this and that, but they forget like what each different person in the group is going to pitch to. And ideally, the way that this works is that you have a different person interviewing for each different topic, and you have a different person pitching each different area, right? So that you don't have every person ask the same questions, right? Like it's kind of annoying as an interviewee, and you get this feeling of disconnect when every single person you sit down with says, so tell me about why you left your last job. You're like, okay, let's talk about that again. Or tries to drill into a specific skill. Like you get it that the company really cares about that skill, but you're like, you don't, like we just went over my JavaScript experience in my last like 1 hour. So you want to ideally plan out in advance that you're going to cover different stuff, right? And you want to do the same with the pitch so that you're not all pitching the mission, right? Because if they come out of every single interview and every single person talks mission, they may not actually get the other areas where your company really shines.
It's another sign that you don't really have it together as well.
A little bit.
Right? They're like, yeah, you guys kind of wing it. You kind of forgot the interview was today, or you're just pulling in whoever's available kind of thing.
Right. And there's a lot that we're winging all the time, right?
Yeah, of
in
course,
a startup. So like, exactly. You just want to kind of like control what you can control. And like, because you are going to be winging plenty of things.
Sure.
So you will want to look good where we can. So putting this all together, basically you want to collect all the material you can. The way to collect the pitch and who's going to do it is to go back to the crazy people who joined you on this adventure, the people that you've already hired, your partners, your other founders, and ask them why they joined you. Why did they decide to do this in the first place? And then I almost said the trump card, but I didn't mean it. The even better thing to do than that is to then say, like, why are you still here? Because again, why people join in the first place and what motivates them once they're in the job aren't necessarily the same. And what you're gathering here are not only the selling points for your company, but you're also gathering the information for what you want that person to pitch in the interview process, right? So if I ask you, like, why did you join? And you're like, the compensation package. And then I'm like, and why are you still here? You're like, now I like everybody, right? Yeah. Then I'm like, ooh, so I have 2 things potentially that you would be good at pitching, like the value of our equity and the relationships that we have with other people here. So it's telling you who on your interview team should probably pitch what, because it's what's really important to them. right? As opposed to just assigning like, you're going to do mission. And you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah,
Great.
they'll tell you're just kind of reciting a preset
Right?
speech.
Okay. So how this looks in a practical example is that Zach, who is the CEO, he was going to interview for culture and he was going to pitch finance, meaning the equity value proposition. And the reason that Zach was going to do that is because that's what Zach pitches super well. That's how he got $150 million in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. Josh is going to interview for collaboration and communication, and he's going to pitch the job and the relationships. David's going to interview for technical skills, and he's going to pitch the technical platform and the tools that the person's going to get to use in the role. So we're going to put it all together. And the first step is going to be to listen to the candidate. Take the time, carve out the time in your interviews to make sure that you're hearing what's important to them. Pitch focusing on the motivators for that specific candidate, and don't forget to expose the underbelly, or basically like what isn't going well in the company. The last thing that you want to do if you want to retain this person is to have them come in and be like unpleasantly surprised that it is a shit show. Like, we want to tell them up front that it is a shit show, and then have them come in and be like, "Ooh, you guys have calendars? That's a good start," right? We want them to be like pleasantly surprised, as opposed to like, "Oh my God, I had no idea what I'm getting into, and now I'm a little scared that I made the wrong decision." So pitch on the specific motivators, but don't forget to talk about the real state of the state and the places where you need help, because that's why you're hiring them. And if you're hiring the right person, that's just going to be a problem they're immediately going to be interested in solving. Tailor the opportunity to their needs. For top talent, don't forget to treat them like an investor, because essentially when somebody takes a below market rate offer, and like, I know that all of you folks are thinking like, I'm making market rate offers. If market rate is set by Google and Apple, you're probably like, if that's the way of thinking about it, then you can see why probably at a start you're not making a market rate offer. So if you think about the delta between what your candidate could make at Google and what they're going to make for you, say that that's like a $60,000 a year delta, then think about the fact that they're basically saying, I'm going to invest $60,000 of my time and money into your company. So pitch them like they're an investor, because that's a lot of money and they're really taking a chance on you. So don't forget to get out a deck and show them, you know, that hockey stick growth that you have planned. Think about involving somebody who's on your board to help seal the deal. Think about getting someone who is an investor, like somebody else who actually put their money on the table to help with this. And like, obviously, like, you don't want to call your investor to help you hire every single person in the org. But when you're making a strategic hire, by all means, like, those folks pitch very well. And it's not a bad idea to ask them to get on the phone with a candidate that you know you want to hire.
There's nothing wrong with just using the pitch deck. I mean, if you have to take out sensitive financials, you can, but you already have it.
Yes, exactly. The right fit will stick and get even more excited. So again, this is like coming back to that idea of like, don't be afraid to talk about the problems that still need to be solved. Like, you know, this is not like a Theranos situation. Like, you want to tell them that the blood draw doesn't work, right? Because these are the people who are going to fix that with you. So we don't want them to come in and find that information out. We want to be super upfront, like, this is what I need help with right now, and get them on board. Okay. So pitching, this is coming back to our example. So the DevOps person that they really wanted to hire, they were able to make the right pitch to get Nick on board, and they hired their first DevOps engineer. And underneath that person was eventually promoted into their head of engineering, and built out a 20-person plus team underneath him. So It all worked out like roses. But what they really heard was, after they made that hire from their board, they heard, congratulations, now you need to make 20 more hires this year, which is the reality of hiring. So congratulations, now you have a little more information, but you are going to many times. The next thing that I always want to know after this is like, okay, like, I got all your information, but like, what are some specific, I'm really quantitative, so like, what are some specific indicators that I am or am not like actually executing this? Like, I get all these things that you're telling us to do, but like, am I doing it right? So one indicator for those of you who also love data of whether or not you're doing this well is that you should have at least a 75% offer to close ratio, meaning like when you make an offer, 75% of the time or more, the candidate actually does join. And the reason that we want this number to be really high is that essentially if you look at the opportunity cost of getting a candidate to the point where you want to make an offer, meaning your teams and your opportunity cost, like you could have been working on your product, right? But instead you interviewed 20 candidates and you brought 5 for on-sites and you brought 3 for second, like there's a ton of money, time invested into this process, like easily $10,000 of internal time. And you want to make this higher, right? So if you don't close this person at this point, that's kind of a sunk cost. So it's super important that when you want to make an offer, they want to join. So your target is a minimum of 75%. Once you're up and running and you have like a people ops person and a recruiting team, you should be hitting 90%.
Wow, that's even higher than I expected.
Yeah, we want it to be really high. And we can talk, data, you can always like lie with numbers. You want to be careful about this stuff. Because the other thing is you could just like not make an offer if they're not going to accept an offer. But like the point of it is more that you want to make sure that you're not basically like for some reason having a miscalibration where you get people all the way to the end and then they drop off repeatedly.
It's like your expectations are just off, whether it's comp or the
something
role.
About it is
you should have filtered it earlier. It's too expensive to wait till the
You
offer.
shouldn't get all the way to there to find out that they don't want the job. That's sooner. Okay. Your conversion rate. So this is another recruiting statistic. And this is about like how people move through your process, which you can think of as a funnel. Essentially, we want at least 50% of candidates to move from one stage to another. So meaning that if the first round interview is a phone call with the hiring manager, ideally at least 50% of the people that the hiring manager speaks to, she wants to bring in for the next stage interview. And ideally 50% of the people who come to that next stage make it through to the next stage. If you have a lower than 50% conversion rate at any point, again, that's just an indicator that there's something about the process that's basically taking more time than it should. So like if there's only a 10% conversion rate, the hiring manager is speaking to 100 candidates to move 10 through, that's just not a good use of her time. We don't want her to have to get on the phone with 100 people to move 10 through. If you have 50% conversion all the way until the last final interview, and then you have 1% conversion, we want to figure out like what's happening at that final interview that all these people who we thought were pretty good, they all wash out when we look at their portfolio. They're like, maybe we need to look at their portfolio sooner.
Or get that
or
stakeholder
have that
earlier.
Person
that's what always happens.
Yep.
It's like I'm the third round interview and I just ding everyone. It's like, well, can we talk before we get to the third round?
Exactly. So the conversion rate, we want to maintain at least a 50% conversion rate stage to stage. This is just an example of like what that math looks like. We want to look out for candidates withdrawing. So anytime you're seeing a lot of candidates withdrawing from the process, that should be just a red flag to you. And like candidates will withdraw, that happens, like they'll take other offers, but you want to look out like, is this a pattern? Am I seeing a lot of it? A way that candidates withdraw is by saying thanks, but no thanks. So sometimes I hear hiring managers say, well, but they said like, thanks. And you're like, well, thanks, but no thanks just means no thanks. Like, just to be clear, that's a no. So this is more of cold prospecting, meaning that you're going out and you're emailing lots of candidates. If you're getting a lot of people saying like, thank you so much for taking the time to reach out to me, but I'm not interested, like I don't even want to talk to you, that's an indicator of a miscalibration. And that's either who you're reaching out to or the opportunity you're putting in front of them like isn't quite what they're looking for. Usually a thanks but no thanks does mean on the positive side that your message came out as authentic enough that they actually feel like it's worth responding at all. So it's better than nothing. Okay, and then it's taking a ton of time. So the third like negative indicator that your process might not be, you're not actually doing it right, is if it's taking you 6 months to make a hire. It's taking you 12 months to make a hire. That's an indicator that something's wrong. It's you have to interview 100 candidates. You know, if you're a hiring manager who says, yeah, for every role I hire, I interview 100 to 200 candidates, that's very hard for you. We should fix that.
The money just doesn't add up because then that means your process took $60,000 to $80,000, and at that point just hire 2 people.
Somehow you need help.
Yeah.
Okay. So how much time do you actually need? Again, like being super quantitative, this is just information that I wish that I had when I was starting hiring people. This is data that comes from Sequoia Capital. So they're a really big VC firm, and they actually published this, which I love. So basically they said in order to generate 100 impressions, which would generate 10 leads, which would generate 7 candidates and 1 offer, it would take an estimate of 990 hours. The way they broke it down is that it would take that much time to hire 12 people, but that included an estimated 40 to 60% of hires coming from referrals. So that means that we already knew the person, like somehow within our organization, and referred them in. What that breaks down to for non-referral hires is about 140 hours per non-referral hire. So this is just to say, that's a lot of time. Hiring takes a lot of time, no matter who is doing it. Our math, so we make hundreds of hires, looks very similar. It comes out, if you look at the very bottom, to about 135 hours per hire. We don't see the kind of conversion rate that Sequoia predicts. We have to reach out to a lot more people. So you see the multipliers like 1,000 impressions, 100 responses, 10 candidates, and 1 offer. So we're driving at the same thing in the same number of hires ultimately, and about the same hours conversion if you put the math in place for this. Because a conversion just to be super clear, like from Sequoia's math, if 40 to 60% of the hires are coming from referrals, there's virtually no lead generation time, which is the majority of where recruiting time comes from. If somebody like the Sourcery is doing, or somebody is like sourcing candidates from scratch, meaning people who you have out of network.
And I think something else, I don't know if their data only comes from portfolio companies, but just by being invested by Sequoia is going to give a conversion advantage, right? It's just the brand. Yep. They almost lend their employer brand to their company.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep. So just to go back over what we've covered, we kind of talked about the talent landscape and what it looks like for everybody right now. We talked about the strategy for the search and why it's so important to kind of get a strategy in place before you get to the pitching part. We talked about what the things are that make up a pitch that works well for top talent. And we talked about how you kind of sew that all together. And that's what I've got.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, we have a couple questions here. I have one other point I want to bring back up that I think you hit on that's really important at that last stage to get your conversion rate up at the offer. Yeah. You were kind of talking about being honest with the underbelly of it, or however you want to talk about it. Yeah, I've seen that be really effective at startups I've worked at before as well, where it's almost kind of like a sales tactic. And then you've always had a salesperson come to you and say, look, I'm just going to be honest with you. That kind of classic phrase. And I'm not saying you have to be so salesy, but one thing I've used is I talked about the hesitations I had before joining. So I said, look, I was also worried that, goal setting is unstable and leadership always changes directions. They address that fear with, OKRs or some goal setting system. And if you talk about you're sort of empathize with them about your own hesitations for joining. I mean, if you're a founder, it's a little different. If you're not a founder and you're a hiring manager that was also hired by one of the founders, that kind of empathy connects with them really well. And then another thing that just on creative sourcing, because you really do have to find, sort of people that are not as easy to reach. I've heard some pretty crazy stories, like hanging out at BART, seeing, right? It's like, okay, we're an East Bay engineering a software company, and we're going to wait at the Oakland BART and find people that are tired of commuting to San Francisco, right? I mean, seriously, I'm giving kind of an extreme example, but it does take things like that to reach candidates that otherwise may never answer your cold outreach. So, you do have to get super creative to reach those people. So one of the questions that was here from Eric Dow is just curious, according to your data, what is the most popular job besides programmer in Silicon Valley? So I'm assuming meaning like hardest to reach. Is it now UI, UX or marketing or some other role?
Like the hardest to recruit for?
Yeah, the hardest to recruit for.
It goes in phases. Usually what's hardest to recruit for is actually stuff that like hasn't been around for a long time. So like Rust.
Is that a framework? Oh, okay. Go, I've heard of, yeah.
And what is super hard about that is that somebody will come to you, I'd like to have somebody with 4+ years of Rust experience. And you're like, that will,
good luck. Yeah.
This hasn't even existed for that long. So stuff that's new that everybody wants that hasn't been around for a long time is the hardest thing to recruit for.
Yep.
I would say right now today that it's full stack JavaScript probably.
Interesting.
Is a really hard one to recruit for because again, just supply and demand are not aligned. So, and if you think about it, right, and like where people get that type of experience, like they're not getting it in school. So maybe they are now actually today, but like that would be very recent. Like you just have to think about like if you think back about like where that experience is coming from, and are people like being churned out with these skills? Like the example, usually like anything where the case is no, but lots of people want that right now. You know, that's going to be what's the
That's
hardest.
a tough one.
Yeah.
Yep.
So still like DevOps, still mobile app development, still JavaScript.
It's still the technical
Those
roles.
things are the hardest.
And a lot of times, because the formal education pipelines, they're just not structurally
exactly.
Yeah, it
That's
takes a
what I'm
while.
saying.
Yeah. Like big data comes out, okay, 6 years later, they come out with a master's track or a specialization track. Yeah. And then, okay, this is the more personal, tricky one here. So I'm not very happy at my current company because of the salary, but I love the people and the culture and the future of the company. What should I do? So this is more of kind of a personal, I mean, you can give it from the recruiter's perspective because you probably run into people in this situation, but you know, I've heard, you hear the statistic, like the only way to get raises sometimes is to jump. So I'm guessing that's what they're kind of referencing, but do you guys have any view on that?
I mean, again, that's kind of coming back to those 6 things that are important to you and which one is the most important. And everybody at some point has like sort of that breaking point where they're like, well, it's this and this, or this has gotten to the point where I'm interested in looking. So it's really that's really kind of personal to you and whether or not the salary is so far off. I guess I would say before looking at a new company to join because of the salary, I would validate your and you probably already have, but I just like validate the assumption that you're not getting market rate and that another company would pay significantly more, because it would just stink to like, you know, put in notice and then try to interview and find out that like actually everybody else wants to pay you the same thing. Yeah,
that's a good point.
So validate sort of your assumption, and just unfortunately you're going to have to wait and think about whether or not this affects you so much that you want to leave. The other thing that I can say from the employer perspective is that it's pretty typical that like if you come with another offer on the table, they will not negotiate with you. So it's better to tell your company that you're unhappy with the compensation and that if that doesn't change, you would be looking to leave, than kind of try to put them in a like,
it's more
I have another offer and I'm leaving position. And ideally, I'm unhappy with the salary and I want to leave should be coupled with like, I think I'm worth this much at a similar type of company, right? Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Because if you think that you're worth this much at a similar type of company, basically you have a little more data to go on than if you're just saying like, I don't like what I make.
Yeah, it's tough. That's a personal one too.
It is really hard.
Okay, and then last question here we'll do is from Zora. What are some best practices to ensure you know what the priorities of your employees are after they have joined? Which is kind of tough because I hope you would know at least. Yeah, you have to do one-on-one. I mean, I hope you get some of the priorities, like you have your grid in terms of what they rank as important before they join, but after they join. So
but truly just asking them. And asking them, like, set up some kind of cadence of doing it so that I think that the thing that's hard, and like this is the same with customer feedback too, whether it's like employee feedback or customer feedback, there's a little part of us that like doesn't really want to ask because you're like, oh, like, you know, asking the question like, do you have any feedback for me, is like hard, right? Because you're like, I'm gonna have to hear it now. So I guess I would say like potentially setting up a cadence where you just like put this on your calendar and you know you're gonna do it and you write out the questions you're gonna ask. That could help because it'll force you to do it. So basically I would check in with your employees, take them out to lunch, and make sure you hit your questions that are like, hey, again, just ask the fluffy question to ask is like, why are you still here? What do you like about what we're doing? What makes you happy? And then ask the question of like, if we were to change something, what would you suggest that we change? You know, ask those things.
Yeah, and even if it's uncomfortable, it's better to sort of release pressure over time than wait until it all blows up, right? You have someone that's like, oh, I've been unhappy for years. Like, oh, I wish I had known, could have done something about it. So anyways, thank you for your questions and thank you for joining everyone. We will send out, we'll have a recording eventually that we can share for later. And some people did request the slides. So if you guys are willing to share them, we can also distribute that to the email list, but up to you guys if you want to share them. And yeah, thank you for joining. If you guys have any questions about One Piece, I'll also share my email afterwards, and then the contact info you have right now on the screen share. So thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Oh, I may just have to put it. Let's see. So we're definitely muted.
It didn't change.
Oh, it didn't change. Strange.